Good evening. I'm Diane Sare, LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate against Chuck Schumer in 2022. And this is the New York Symposium. And we are going to be brief tonight because tomorrow is a major international conference of the Schiller Institute, which if you can pull that up on the screen, I'd like everyone watching to register to make note of the website schillerinstitute.com. The conference is entitled "The Moral Collapse of the Transatlantic World Cries Out for a New Paradigm." You can get to that. There we go. No, that's the previous conference. At any rate, if you go to schillerinstitute.com, you will pull that up. And it'll be starting at 9 a.m. tomorrow. And that's fine. We can come back. So 9 o'clock tomorrow, schillerinstitute.com. The first panel is entitled "The March of Folly. Can Mankind Still Extinguish the Now Lit Fuse of Thermonuclear War?" And I would say this is extremely timely, number one, because tomorrow, May 8th, is the day that people in the United States are celebrating the Immortal Regiment, which is a Russian holiday, but also celebrated by American World War II veterans. The Immortal Regiment being those who gave their lives to defeat the Nazis in World War II. VE Day is the 8th and the 9th. And this year is the 76th anniversary of the defeat of Hitler. You would think the world has completely forgotten that because we are on a trajectory towards war with Russia or with China or both, and that has to be pulled back. The panel tomorrow afternoon, which Dennis Speed will be moderating, and he'll be speaking this evening on Francisco Goya and what we should learn from him and the relevance. I think it's a very good prelude to tomorrow's conference. The afternoon panel, which begins at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, is called "The Method of the Coincidence of Opposites. Only a united worldwide health effort without sanctions can reverse a worldwide pandemic." And just a couple things I should say. One, if you haven't seen or heard about it, India right now is experiencing a horrific onslaught from the COVID pandemic. It had looked initially like India had fared rather well, but there are new strains of the virus which apparently can kill you before you even test positive, although they're having massive rates. I think yesterday, 412,000 new positive tests, 4,000 deaths, but that is probably an undercount by 4 or 5 times because they're only counting the number of people who die in the hospitals. So it's estimated that between 1 and 2 million people in India have now succumbed to this disease. And certain things, measures have been taken, but there's nothing on the scale of what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been calling for. On the war danger, I will just say, in terms of Russia in particular, you had a meeting of the UN Security Council called by the Russian ambassador Nebenzia to the United Nations. May 2nd was the 7th anniversary of a horrible burning alive of over 40 Russian speakers in Odessa in Ukraine, where they were surrounded by these Nazi troops, which is what Victoria Nuland and Barack Obama put in power in Ukraine, herded into the labor union building, locked inside, and the building was set on fire and they were burned to death. And what the Russian ambassador wanted to get across is what it's like living under a Nazi sympathetic regime in Ukraine, which continues to shell the Donbass and other regions. The response from the United States and other NATO countries to Russia's warning about what's going on is, quote, "We remain saddened by the tragic loss of lives in Odessa on the 2nd of May, 2014. We urge Russia to stop politicizing human tragedies." Well, is it not political if you're rounded up and burned to death because you speak Russian? is nothing to be said about that. So the tone deafness of the United States and the Western leaders is extremely dangerous, because they have to understand there are certain lines that if they are crossed, Russia and or China will have to respond. Putin has already warned that they will respond asymmetrically to various provocations, including a recently foiled plot to assassinate President Lukashenko of Belarus. So I will stop there and allow Dennis Speed to present to you something which I think is very apropos for today. And you might imagine what these artists would be saying about our time.
Well, thank you, Diane. What we're going to do tonight is to try to give you a reason to be in attendance at tomorrow's conference, but to give you also hope for why, having attended such a conference, you might be able to do something about the actual circumstances that surround our lives in both the United States and worldwide. Now, we're involved in a process that we do not understand. And I don't mean just you or I mean everybody. There's no one on the planet that actually understands the process. People pretend to, but the reason that they don't is because there are laws of physics and biophysics that are actually at work, which are the very frontiers of science. They're at the very sort of edges of our scientific knowledge and capability. I'm not really simply referring to the recent coronavirus pandemic focus, but I'm referring to the fact that for a period of time since the 1970s, a pool of a combination of retroviruses and other forms of disease has been allowed to spread as a result of the economic and financial policies of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And these policies were not exclusive to the banking system, but they were carried out through the banking system. And this was done on behalf of the dying Anglo-American empire located in the city of London, not Wall Street. Wall Street is a subsidiary of that empire. As in the case of the Persian Empire of the period of 550 BC, people believed that the Persians were the most important power on earth, but they weren't. It was Babylon. It was the priesthood at Babylon that determined what the Persians thought and therefore what they did. And in the same case, that's the case with the United States today. The United States is not the most powerful nation in the world. Well, first of all, China is actually the most powerful nation, but from the standpoint of actually the issue of power, it's the city of London. It's far more powerful financially, and mostly more important from an ideational standpoint. If you look, for example, at people like Samantha Power or Susan Rice, or you look at others, and you look at where they're educated, you'll find that Cambridge and Oxford will invariably come up. And even if they didn't go to school there originally, the idea of academic excellence that is portrayed, particularly in the diplomatic services, always converges on those two institutions and their derivative institutions in the United States, such as Harvard and Princeton. And what we're here to do tonight is to try to give an insight into a mind of a genius who saw reality as it was, which is the same sort of thing that we have to do now. So we don't have a way right now. The nature of our political system does not provide a way for the transatlantic world to survive. What is provided is there's a history which was conducted through the American Revolution, and that history would allow us to survive. But you'd have to really understand what the American Revolution was. It was an international revolution. We're going to say something about that here tonight. And we're going to begin this by focusing on the figure of the artist Francisco Goya. Can I have the first illustration? This is Francisco Goya, who lived between 1746 and 1827. This is a self-portrait, which is done at the age of approximately 39 to 40. Many people who see this portrait speak about it as being Goya as Beethoven because of the reminiscence of the figure. He was a figure who was born in a humble means, sort of a lower middle class, became the court painter of Spain, became a very important associate with the political element that was called Las Luces, which is the enlightened, and was identified with Republican causes. Next. As a young man, Goya came into contact partially because of his being patronized by Carlos III, the King of Spain, became king in 1759 when Goya was 13 years old, and remained, came to about, I think, 1786. And Goya became affiliated with what were called the French and Dutch and American factions. Here he's dressed in the garb of a Frenchman, and this would later be used as the frontispiece for one of his most important works, which I'll discuss in a moment. Next. He was born in a place called Fuente de Todos in the province of Zaragoza, which is what you're seeing here. And you see it also in that small map. It's the northeastern corner of Spain. Next. He emulated the painter Velázquez, Diego Rodriguez Velázquez, who was born in 1599 and died about 1661. So Goya was born about 80 years later. And Velázquez represented, earlier than Goya, a kind of revolt against the decadence of Spain, the decadence that was well illustrated by Miguel Cervantes' book Don Quixote. Spain had been dominated by the Habsburg Empire, and from really the time of the ascendance of the Inquisition during the period of the 1460s and 1470s, Spain began its decline, and Velázquez was a kind of earlier precursor to Goya and his ideas. Next, please. The daring way in which Velázquez defied convention in art was an illustration of things to come in Spain later. This is one of the most famous paintings in the world called Las Meninas. This is a painting of the royal family. And as you can see, it's not a very staid or posed painting. In fact, you can't really see the royal family. You see the most prominent figure there on the far right is a dwarf who was one of the sort of entertainers of the family. And you see the dog in the front, who's done with great dignity. But actually, you see everybody else in sort of a state of array. And on the left, you see the painter, Velázquez, whose act of painting is actually the subject of this painting. Next. This is a close-up, which shows you. So the clear person that is seen and portrayed with great dignity, although it's also true of the dwarf as well, is Velázquez. And what's important here is to understand that in the arts in Spain, as in literature, and also in painting, that's where you saw what we will call the humanist tendency, which opposed the Inquisition and opposed the ideas of the Inquisition. Next. One of the most important ideas of the Inquisition was its racism, its expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, and then its expulsion of the Moors from Spain slightly thereafter. This is a portrait done by Velázquez of Juan de Pareja, who was a slave that Velázquez owned and freed. He was also a painter, and he's not in. This is a portrayal that Velázquez did of him in 1650, which became one of the most famous paintings in the world because of its showing the internal dignity. And of course, you see the focus on the painter's hand. That is to say that Juan de Pareja was a painter. He both mixed paints and he did paintings. He later became a major painter in Spain on his own right, having attained his freedom. Next. This is a picture that was done by Velázquez. He was 29 years old. And it is an indication of his development of a social conscience. As I said, he was born in 1746. By the age of 13, he was apprenticed to become a painter. And when he was 13 years old, Carlos III came to power. And it's important, we'll see something about Carlos in a minute. But this is an engraving done by Goya. And what it's showing you is an execution. And the method of execution is strangulation. And what you're seeing there is the man at the point that he begins to die. He begins to become asphyxiated by that chain around his neck. He's got a cross in his hand. You've got the candle in front of him, which is marking his last day, hours on earth, minutes on earth. And his toes have begun to convulse. You can't see that clearly necessarily in the print, but that's what this is. And so this was Goya finding a way through illustration to challenge the established order. That order, particularly as the Inquisition had so brutally asserted that in Spain on questions of faith, as they called it. Next. This is a painter, Anton Raphael Mengs. He was one of Goya's teachers. And although they didn't get along, and eventually Goya was not studying with him, he was German, and he was assigned to the court. Mengs was part of the faction, the Republican faction, called Las Luces in Spain. This is a self-portrait that was done by Mengs, and what's important here that's showing it, it's done in 1776, I believe, and is that the realism, the concept of not trying, and also the idea of the artist as being the subject of a painting, as opposed to noblemen as such. We saw that earlier with Juan de Pareja as well. But I should say that in the case of the Juan de Pareja painting, that was painted, as Velázquez called it, as an excuse to get the flesh tones right for another painting he was making of the Pope. Here, the painter simply paints himself as such. And this is something that Goya picked up in part from Mengs, but also had it already in his own mind. Next. This is a self-portrait of Goya that Goya did, which gives you the same idea. You get this, of course, it harkens back to what we saw at the very beginning with his the original first image that we showed you. Next. Goya did this portrait when he was 69 years old. He was very ill at the time. Next. And 5 years later, this is his self-portrait with Dr. Arrieta, who kept him alive. He stayed with the doctor for about 5 or 6 weeks. And as a token of his both appreciation and gratitude to the doctor, he painted this portrait. This is not a portrait which is anything other than obviously one of both agony, but it harkens back to another portrait by Velázquez called The Water Cellar. Won't go through that now as to why that's the case, but you see the doctor caring for his patient, and you see the way in which he has him cradled there in his arms. But the important idea here is that painting is not for the purpose of simply doing pretty illustrations or mere realism, but it has to have a topic, it has to have a subject, and the subject here is the relationship between the two men. Next. This is Carlos III of Spain. This is not by Goya, but this is him in his garb. He supported the American Revolution just as France did, and he supported it with millions of dollars. In matter of fact, they created, for the first time in their history, they floated state bonds to support the American Revolution. That was back in 1780 and 81, after John Jay of New York had traveled to Spain and organized support for financial support for the American Revolution there at the same time that Ben Franklin was in France. Next. This is a portrait of the same king done by Francisco Goya. And you can see that this is not particularly respectful, as they say, but the king loved the portrait. And it's him in hunting dress, and just shows him in a way that was considered to be scandalous by some people at the court, but was Goya painting his friend, the Republican king, who would rule until 1786. Next. This is a painting that's fairly famous and is sometimes called the Red Boy, but it's a painting of Manuel Osorio Manrique de Zuniga, done in 1787 when Goya is about 31 years old. Now, the painting was commissioned by the boy's father. His father's name was Vicente Joaquin Osorio de Mocoso y Guzman. He was one of the founders of the Bank of Spain. It's called the Banco de San Carlos. This bank was formed in order to finance the American Revolution. And was formed as a kind of national bank of Spain. And this was done with the full support of the king. The portrait has become famous for many reasons, but you can see there down at the bottom, this was, I think, 1787. So the king had just gone out of being in power. And down there, you see the bird, and you see the string from the hand, you see the bird, and you see in the bird's beak a little note. And the note says Francisco Goya. And you see the cats behind the bird. And this was Goya's comment on what he considered to be the precarious situation of not only himself, but the Republican cause in the aftermath of the leaving of the king. Next. This is his father, one of the members of the Bank of Spain. Next. And now we're talking here about some of the people who were important literary and otherwise figures which were influential on Goya. So Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos was a writer. This is an interesting painting, and you can't quite tell it. This you have to see in person to really get the point of what I'm about to say. But that green figure you see, which is seemingly on the top of or the stand behind the table, actually, is Athena. And you can't tell it from here on the painting, but it's actually transparent, so that it has this quality of being not quite painted in the painting, but at the same time, clearly it represents the ephemeral nature of reason, which hovers over the painting and hovers over the author. We'll say more about him in a moment. Next. Benjamin Franklin, I mentioned, he was sort of the intellectual center of the international movement, which was establishing these forms of both banking institutions and militaries and militias globally. It was not merely to go to finance the American Revolution, but the American Revolution was seen as a way of countering the impact of the British Empire globally. Remember, there was a League of Armed Neutrality formed by Catherine the Great of Russia. There was, as I said, as we know, Carlos III, and there was, and let's go to the next slide, Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais. Beaumarchais of France, together with Vergennes, who was the finance minister, was instrumental in assisting Ben Franklin in securing the support of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette for the American Revolution. Beaumarchais is actually very familiar to you if you know anything about opera, because you've heard of an opera called The Marriage of Figaro. And the character Figaro is Beaumarchais, who did many of the things that the character Figaro is alluded to do in the Mozart opera. But I just wanted to and he was the author of the actual both book idea and the conception, but he was the character himself. And these characters, there were a lot of them: John Jay, Silas Dean, Lafayette, Carlos, and the people that supported this cause in Spain and France. This was this coalition of forces that put together the financing for the American Revolution. Next. Pedro Rodriguez de Compomanes. Now, he is the actual founder of the Bank of Spain. He spoke Greek, Latin, and Arabic. He went out as an adolescent to teach literature to poor children. Carlos III made him what he called the fiscal of the Council of Castile, meant the finance ministry. And that was in 1763, and he kept that post for 20 years. They founded the bank, I think, in June of 1782. Next. Well, that's okay. Francisco de Caboras, who was the person who largely tried to finance the bank himself. This portrait was done in 1788. This is 6 years after they successfully founded the bank, because when they tried to float bonds to support the American Revolution. And even though they put a lot of money into it, and Caboras, who was actually originally French and to become a Spanish citizen for the purpose of being able to argue for the creation of the bank, they couldn't really get the financing together, and so they had to extend it to the Netherlands and to France. And so he, Jovellanos, Compomanes, and the others are the center of a grouping that Goya is part of, and he paints all of their pictures. Next. Now we come to something a little later. That was the happy period of the 1770s and 80s, into the point at which there was a defeat of the Republican cause. Eventually, what would happen is that there would be an overthrowing of the progressive wing of the monarchy, and there would also be the destruction of the French Revolution, which would be destroyed by 1795. that would happen as a result of what the British and others did. And Goya commented upon this in the destruction of Spain in a series, which was called Los Caprichos. This is the frontispiece of that series. And this is Goya. And you can see from the way he looks to the side, he's going to take you through what had happened to Spain. And what we're going to do here is we're not going to try to go through each by allusion to the history. We're just going to try to give you a sense of what Goya's work and what he was doing as a satirist, but more importantly, a social commentator. Next. This is the series is the first time that you have a kind of set of satirical cartoons. Others had done similar things earlier in different ways, including in the Renaissance, but no one did it like Goya. And his idea was to identify for people their own problems from within. So this is called No One Knows Himself. It's a masquerade, and you can see that everybody has a mask on. And he had a commentary, which does not appear here, where he says, and as a result of everyone wearing masks, no one knows himself. Next. Even this close up, he can't see who she is. I think that doesn't have to be explained. Next. Now, this is important because this is called humility versus arrogance. And that is a metaphor for Napoleon Bonaparte. You can see the man has got his arm behind his back instead of like, Napoleon would have it in front of him. Maybe he's also got his arms tucked into his vest. Who knows? Try doing that yourself, right? And you'll see why that poses the epitome of arrogance. And you see these poor people who are pleading, trying to propitiate something which you cannot appeal to. Okay, next. Now, this begins to get us into how Goya's view, and there's a caption here which is written. And what it basically says is that the asses are very pleased at the fact that their performance is so well received. Their performance as human beings is so well received. You see this character who's even worse than they are, who's fawning in front of them and trying to give them deference. Okay, next. And this one says the oil merchant sees who they are and says, hey, you, and beats them, and they go off resentful of the fact that their performance is not appreciated. And here we have a sort of theme that is all throughout Goya's work. We don't have time to go through it, which is that he's very clear that it's the people who are the working people of Spain who are the only people that truly have a sense of how decadent the rulers and the oligarchy of that country is. Next. This is the beginning of his Los Desastres de la Guerra, the disasters of war. And much of this is the commentary on the guerrilla war, first called it between 1812 and 1808 and 1812 that was fought in the country. And so what we're going to see here is a set of engravings he did. This is called Sad Presentiments of What is About to Occur, sort of a forecasting of the great disaster that will come on to Spain. Next. This is called I Saw This. And this is Goya, not in the sense that the person's Goya, but he is talking about things he saw during the war. And then he gives social commentary on these things. Okay, you can see the women and children there. Let's go to the next one. This one is called The Ravages of War. This is an explosion that has just happened. The floor has given way, and these figures have been killed, and they're falling to the bottom. Next. This figure is, I don't remember the exact caption, but the notion is, it does no good to complain. And the woman is about to be killed by a robber during the war. She's being led into a cave. She and the child, who of course is appropriately terrified because they will both not come out alive. Next. This is called Cartloads to the Cemetery. And this person is a person that did not die in the war, but died of famine, which was another one of the great plagues of course, of war, as we see it today in the world, particularly in parts of the continent of Africa. Next slide. And this is called And There Is No Help. And this is a firing squad. You can see that there's an individual behind who is sunk to his knees. And this man refuses to do so. The other one has been killed in front of him. Next. And this is Goya's great painting, The 3rd of May, 1808, which was the beginning of the period of the invasion, which was by the Napoleonic forces at the time. And it shows, and importantly, the figure in white in defiance of any kind of capitulation to the indignity. And this sort of was a forecast of the guerrilla war. It was the first time in history was used that would ensue. Next. The sleep of reason produces monstruos. El sueño de la razón. This is one of the most famous of Goya's illustrations. We put it here because this is how Goya, and this is thought to be Goya himself, sort of as an illustrator, showing this, but he's trying to show reason has fallen asleep. And now you're beginning to see reason being haunted in various ways by the alphabet, the large cat there on the floor. And now what Goya does is he transitions, and he does something which few other artists had done in history. Let's go to the next one. This shows something very much like the sleep of reason. This is a nun who is awakened to someone playing a guitar. And there's a sort of theme. You'll see it in things like Hans Holbein's The Dance of Death. Nuns who are entertaining lovers who come to them, and they have bad consciences. And this is one of such illustration. Next. This is a matter of the delusions. You have the sleep of reason, then you have delusion. And so this says, until death, hasta la muerte. Okay, so she's going to act out and think of herself as being a lot younger. And you see the younger people, including what are supposed to be some young suitors in the back there, and you see their actual view of her. Next. What a beak of gold. And this shows the problem of academia as Goya had seen it. The failure of the universities to teach anything of great substance, and the pretentiousness of those that read it, their irrelevant ideas in the course of the destruction of the Republic and the return to the decadence of Spain, and then, of course, the war. Next. This one is in the same series, but this is a later one. This is called Bon Voyage. And it said, where are they going, these creatures of the night? And they're flying off, and you see what are clearly creatures from the subconscious, if you want to put it that way. And this is the theme that Goya hits at very much, and which it became something very much used by Lyndon LaRouche in various ways to illustrate the true underlying problem that you're actually dealing with in politics. You're dealing with the problem of the ghosts of public opinion, and the ghosts of peer group pressure, and the ghosts that haunt the inside of the minds of the people that won't do what's right because they're trying to appeal to an invisible internal audience that says it's more important to be approved of, to get along with people, to win friends and influence people, than to stand up for the truth. Next. And this one is at the end of the series of the entirety of the Los Caprichos, and it says, now is the time. It shows a group of people. These are all clerics, so they're all dressed as clerics. Goya was not very fond of the church because he thought of its entire lack of morality. And the other portion of this, sometimes when it's printed, says, quick before they wake up. Next. The artist Hieronymus Bosch, who preceded Goya by about 400 years, not quite, by about 350 years, had pioneered this idea of looking into the unconscious. In your illustration, if you're looking at the bottom left and you see that creature crawling up into the body of the egg, and you see a man that's leaning over the egg and staring out with his hand on his head, and that is the artist Hieronymus Bosch, who painted himself as inside of hell, and then chronicling what he saw inside of hell. You see the soft parade above the head of the figure on the disc with the red bagpipe, which shows this sort of merry folly the way in which people will happily march to their doom and beyond their doom, rather than face the truth. Next. This is an illustration which we put in because it should be known that it was illegal for anybody who was in the nobility or the aristocracy or was in the military, and for that matter, to work in Spain. Those are all considered to be above the station of people. And when you're leading Don Quixote de la Mancha, that's the sort of idea, the mad knight and the peasant, the degraded peasant. And the two of them are going around into a Spain which really no longer exists. This was an illustration that Goya did to show the asses of the oligarchy and aristocracy on the backs of those who can't carry them. And that's why it's called Thou Who Canst Not. These are all, the captions were all done by the artist. Next. Yes, and this is the clergy. And this one is called They Eat a Lot. And I don't think I have to illustrate that. I think it's very well as, I don't have to say anything about that. Next. This one is a famous story, or became a famous story, which was told actually in Goya's hometown about a constable. Now, the thing was, you could get a right to become a kind of a sheriff. Constable Lampiños is this guy. And you could buy the right to go around and be your own enforcer. For those of you who are thinking that you have problems with police forces and people in them today in America, there's a little of a tradition of that. So this is a character, Lampiños, who used to go around. He had a badge and he had bought the rights for it. And he would go around and break up fights and do things. So that's the first one. Next. But he was known for being highly unjust, and he had a certain problem with certain of the women of the area. So this shows you the revenge against Constable Lampiños. And yes, that is a syringe, and yes, that is it being placed in a certain sensitive area of his anatomy. And what was being done was they were putting quicklime in there, and what that does is it solidifies like a cement. And yes, it expands and it basically kills you. These are things that Goya knew of and was told about. This was the Spain of Goya's time. Next. This one is called, Well, It's Your Own Fault. And what this is just an illustration of a man who has clearly had a certain relationship with this woman who has followed him. And you can decide to think about it as though he's trying to help her up, but actually, I don't think that's the case. And so Goya calls it, It's Your Own Fault. The notion being that the complicity in decadence among men and women, among men and men, and women, right? All those things that people are talking about today about being the rights and the great nobility of LGBTQ XYZ. Goya wasn't having it. He didn't believe in it. He thought there was a level of self-deception that people should understand causes their own self-destruction. Next. So this is the Bullfights of Spain. Goya was asked to give do a certain set of illustrations. He did these actually over a long period of time, but these tended to be done in the period after the war. It's around about 1815 into 1820 or so. This is an illustration he did of an actual bullfight which went wrong and killed the mayor. I forget which town that is. And that's the showing of the killing of the mayor. And you see the horns of the bull sticking out of the back of the mayor. Next. This is an illustration I decided to put in. It's also from Goya, the twin bull ring, because I think it well illustrates the conditions of the Republican and Democratic Party of our own time. And what you have is people sitting there on the fence, and you have others there staring at the slaughter. You see the man in the front at the bottom left, just sort of staring over, watching calmly as the bullfighter, in this case, is about to execute the bull. You see the people on the fence, are one or two of them a little bit concerned. You go down to the middle of the painting. And then you see on the far, in the upper right, left corner, slaughter, and you have some people trying to clear things out. Let's go to the next one. And this he called Spanish entertainment, in which the people themselves get into the bull ring And the people themselves begin to have fun. You see there down at the bottom, people are being killed, and you have the people playing Matador, and they're all smiling. I guess they've probably legalized marijuana there. Maybe they legalized heroin. Maybe they legalized other things. But in any case, it shows you this is the entertainment of the people. I mean, this is their recreational drug of choice. Next. This illustration and the one that follows were done by Goya as metaphors for the Spanish state, Spanish Constitution. And this one is called He Defends Himself Well. And this was done by Goya to illustrate, this was just before he went into exile, actually, the still resilience of a Republican faction in Spain that tried to resist, though ultimately to be defeated, the return of the aristocracy, monarchy, and the destruction of the revolution that they had tried to initiate. Next. And this was a very specific thing. At the Spain of the time used the idea of the Spanish people and the state as like a tree. And they talked about having to water the roots of the tree and how it would grow up and it would be able to flourish and so on. But Goya did a little bit of a dance on that, because some of the right-wing people, you had this habit in the Spain of the time of arriving to court in cloaks, and they were sort of informants, but they also were, it was sort of like the McCarthy era, or for that matter, the era of today, the one that they're about to bring back with what they're doing with farming out and privatizing investigations of the events of January 20th. And so this is just an illustration of what he called complete folly. These are all called follies. Next. This is called Merry Folly. Sort of a disco, early disco. I don't think I have to say much more about that. But again, think about Spanish entertainment and you get the same idea. You have these old men, three old men, and some quite a bit younger, the two women on the far right. Next. This one is called Personal Folly. What you see here is a little bit hard to see it in the illustration. So I'll just say you see the woman waving to the man on the left. And then you see a man there, bottom right, with his hair sort of out. You see him screaming. And you see another head there, if you look carefully. And she's consorting with a group of witches. And you see someone on the far right, you see a woman with a stick, probably turning a kind of bubbling pot or something of that type. And again, here what Goya is doing is getting at the deeper idea of duplicity, double-facedness, literally, which is the character of personal folly. That is what brings about the diseases in the state, the diseases in the body politic, and the diseases in culture as a whole. Next. This one is called Truth is Dead. This was actually originally at the end of the disasters of war. Next slide. This one was called But Will She Rise Again? And that was the way that it ends. So truth is dead, will she rise again? Next. Goya's notion was that reason was like a sleeping giant that had to be awakened. This is what this illustration is showing, is the sudden awakening of the giant. You can't quite see it in this illustration, but there's a lot of small houses and small people down there in the front of the paint of the illustration. Next. And this is the Awakened Colossus. And you see people scattering there. You can't tell whether exactly the character, but you see, and this was the idea of a reawakened reason that Goya hoped would come about sometime in the future. And of course, that's what his paintings were for. Next. I wanted to put this in because this was done by Goya around about 1824. He would have been about 80 years old when he did this. Maybe a little bit older, actually. And people had thought Goya was sort of very old. He was losing his ability to paint. But this is what he was doing to the end of his life. By the time he got to the end of his life, he's painting largely without a brush. He didn't always paint without a brush, but he could do it. He would also challenge people to just put little blotches of ink on a piece of paper, and he would do drawings He was in exile at that time in Bordeaux, France, where he had gone because of the repression that had come about in Spain. Next. But Goya had this idea about himself, and this is an illustration he made about himself, which says, as you can see, still learning. To the day he died, Goya became greater, his mind became clearer, his commitment to the truth became stronger, and it's that we will need in this time to face the truth of our situation. So that's what we wanted to say, and that is the idea and the purpose and function of our meeting tomorrow and what our movement is all about. Okay, that's what I had.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I hope people will share this and take time to re-watch it, review it, because it was very quick and there's a lot in all of those paintings and etchings that you showed. Just to reiterate, the conference starts at 9 a.m. tomorrow. It's at schillerinstitute.com. And everybody should listen. The first panel begins at 9, the second at 1 p.m. Is there anything else, Dennis, that you want to say about it?
No, I just think that people will, if you're there for 9 o'clock, you're going to be treated to a truthful and inspiring picture of the world. Yes, there are great problems, but there is also great solutions. You'll see the great people who are there to talk to you about them. I think that's really going to surprise you. And in terms of the second part, this is our Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites that's now been doing some projects in Washington, D.C., and also in Africa. And they'll be talking about that. And they are with respect to this idea of how do you deal with the 300 million people that are about to die in the world of famine, while you're trying to deal with the millions of people that are also afflicted by coronavirus. Clearly, you have to come by a completely new idea. And that's what we want to try to put forward tomorrow in both panels, but panel 2 will be completely devoted to that.
Great. So I'd encourage everybody to join us tomorrow, and we'll be back here next week at 7:30 p.m. Thanks very much. Thank you, Dennis.
Sure. Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.